Welcome to Nerdcultuur, and today we're doing another video in English because this is a very important movie, an important topic, and I feel like a lot of people here in Holland haven't seen this movie. Because we're talking about maybe the most controversial movie of the year so far, What is a Woman? That was released by Daily Wire starring Matt Walsh. And a lot of critics, Hollywood critics at least, have refused to talk about this movie, mostly just because they already had preconceived notions of what it would be. But I myself was also kind of doubting about whether I would talk about it, mostly because this is such a sensitive topic and it's kind of hard to speak about it without triggering or offending some people. But before I talk about the movie itself, I do have to question the release strategy for Daily Wire a little bit, because I think it's not a great idea to release this movie behind a paywall, especially as some other reviewer had described this movie. This is like a weapon of mass destruction in the culture wars, and I feel it needs to be seen by as many people as possible. So I myself used to be a lot more left-leaning and liberal, but in the last few years I've kind of become a little bit more centrist, and it's mostly because the left has become so radical, and this is like a typical example of that. This ideology is very easy to dismantle, as this movie proves, because when you get to the point where you can't even answer basic questions about reality for fear of possibly offending somebody, that's where you really are limiting your free speech and you're limiting what people can talk about. And it's kind of hard to not notice the contrast in this movie between people who actually want to talk about this and know what they're talking about, and people who get offended by the slightest bit of questioning. And you know, this is a Daily Wire movie, so you expect it to be a little bit more conservative and right-leaning, but I feel this movie does a very good job of being kind of balanced, for a large majority of it at least. Because Matt Walsh doesn't really inject his own views into this movie. He really does try to be as objective as possible. He's just talking to these people and letting them talk for as long as they need to. And he really does use the tool of silence in an effective way. Sometimes these people have these log lines and pre-programmed responses, but then once they actually say it, they have nothing to back that statement up with. So it's kind of telling that he doesn't even start with what is a woman. That is usually like the fatality question, the one that ends the interview in most cases. I do have to at least give some respect to the people that were interviewed and just remained seated and kept talking, even though they were kind of bothered by the way he was questioning them. Because there's a couple of examples of people just breaking up the interview with like such a basic question that it really does look bad on their part. And the movie does have a really good flow to it. It's also not very long. It's about 90 minutes and every minute is used, because you really do feel like you're going along on this adventure with Matt Walsh and you're following him as he's seeking answers and he's speaking to all these different people and getting all these different responses and perspectives. And even though he doesn't inject his own views into the conversation, you really can see his personality shine through in this. He has such a dry sense of humor and he has such a deadpan delivery of almost everything he asks them, and certain like facial responses to the things they are saying are absolutely priceless. And in the 90 minutes it really is structured in a neat 3-act structure. So you have a beginning where you're mostly just laughing at what these people are saying and you're getting all these different perspectives and you're kind of starting to understand how ridiculous it all is. And it's kind of tough to dive into all of them because this movie tackles this issue on all different fronts, whether it's like sports or children transitioning or just different types of gender ideologies. He's talking to surgeons and experts on these hormones and politicians and people on the street, and everybody has a different response. And it's really telling that even the people on the street are unable or unwilling to just give a basic normal answer to the question. And it's obviously not that they don't know what a woman is, they're just afraid to say it because they know it could have bad consequences for them. And that's just the people on the street. I feel like the other people in this movie, the professionals, they have a lot more malice behind it. Their reasoning for not answering the question has more so to do with money and their own careers. And they do really dive into that later on in the movie, where they really show that every person who decides to transition is basically just a gold mine for the pharmaceutical companies. And we're really seeing it getting mainstreamed and getting pushed to the forefront, and more people are starting to accept this ideology. And they even start to believe in transitioning children. So we're seeing it even on Disney programming and Nickelodeon and these types of channels. And that's why I feel like this movie is also released at just a perfect moment in time, because there needs to be a little bit more of a pushback. It's starting to get there, but I feel like people are just now waking up to all this. But then it also like covers this issue in different areas, like in women's sports or in Canada, where you're not even allowed to misgender somebody anymore and you could go to prison for that. And that's really what the second act of this movie focuses on, is basically just the parts of this whole ideology that can get you mad, because it's really showing all the damage it could do. And obviously there are success success stories within the trans community as well. There's people who have done it and just live happy, peaceful lives. But those are mostly anecdotes, and they refer to science that was obviously influenced by activist organizations. There's literally a body for transgender research that's automatically accepted into the American Psychological Association without questioning it or looking at it. And they do bring up a study during this film that's the only study that's been done over a very long period of time involving a lot of people. And that study showed that transitioning people not only doesn't help them and reduce the suicide rates actually went up. And that's also kind of where I'm coming from with this movie, because I have a bachelor's degree in psychology. I'm not going to pretend I'm like a highly educated doctor or anything, but I do remember being taught about gender identity disorder and gender dysphoria back in class, and they were still honest enough to admit there wasn't really a good reasoning for changing that. It was mostly based on people's feelings and not wanting to hurt people's feelings, so they felt like disorder kind of had a negative stigma to it, so they changed it to dysphoria. But it is an actual disorder. It's not that different from people with anorexia or people that want to like not have an arm anymore. That's also like an example they bring up during this movie. And with all those other types of disorders, we don't just affirm people's belief, we question them, we bring them back to reality. But just with this gender issue, we don't seem to be able or willing to do that. And there's another aspect of this movie that people don't really touch on enough, which is temperament and personality. Jordan Peterson brings that up. And of course, I do think highly of Jordan Peterson, even though I don't agree necessarily with everything he says. For the most part, his opinions are really well thought out and built on science. And he's a clinical psychologist, and he really does point out in a helpful way that there really shouldn't be such a thing as a gender affirming therapist, because affirming and therapy are kind of contradictions in themselves. A job of a therapist is never to affirm whatever their patient is saying. It's always to question and make the patient realize their own insights. So of course you're going to have men and boys that are a little bit more feminine, and you're going to have women and girls that are more masculine, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are the opposite gender or the opposite sex. And especially when you're pushing this on young children, they always make decisions without even really thinking about it. There's no way they could realize what it actually means, because these are decisions that will impact the rest of their lives, and it shouldn't be enough that the parents just want to do it. A child should make that decision when they're old enough and when they're really confident that they actually want to do this. They've had plenty of time to think about it and think it through. Because for the most part with adults, I really don't care. Just do what you want. If you want me to address you in a certain way in an interaction, I will always be respectful, of course. It's just the way that it's being pushed right now and almost celebrated as something inherently positive that shouldn't really be the case. This should always be a condition that only occurs in a very small percentage of the people, because it's always been that way throughout history, and all the increases we're seeing right now can only really be attributed to social pressure. And to outright deny that aspect of this whole phenomenon really does delegitimize these doctors in a really apparent way. So one of the most powerful parts of this movie was also talking to a woman who had transitioned to be a man, but she is really able to admit she will never actually be a man. So she describes herself as a woman that has transitioned to appear like a man, and even that in itself would be offensive to some people. But she really does have a heartbreaking story, because she tells about the complications that could come from surgeries and hormones and all the side effects that the medical industry doesn't really warn you about. And I feel like her story is probably the most powerful story in this documentary, because it's the type of story we don't really see in media all that often, because the mainstream media would never tell it like that. And you can't look at that story and not consider that this person is also coming with good intentions. They have their own perspective, their own lived experience, as people like to say nowadays. And their stories and experiences are basically just as valid as people who have had successful transitions, but you don't really hear from them. And another lie they kind of dismantle in this movie that I really enjoy is that the whole gender sex structure is a Western colonial idea, which is kind of ridiculous, because that has literally nothing to do with culture or race. It's only based on biology. We see it in every other animal. And of course there are some exceptions. There's intersex people and people where it's a bit more like complicated, but those are really small minor exceptions, and we shouldn't change the structure and the rules of our entire society based on that very small percentage. And even those people, they just choose to identify with one or the other. They're not something in between, and that's like a newer category. That's the whole non-binary thing that's been invented in recent years. So Matt Walsh actually goes to Africa and he talks to African tribes about this issue, and their reactions are priceless. Those are probably some of the funniest moments in this movie, and it really does illustrate how ridiculous this whole concept is, especially to outsiders, people who are really not familiar with it. And it also kind of exposes a sort of inherent logic flaw, because these African tribes are just very familiar with gender roles, and for them sex and gender is just the same thing, and it's been that way for most of human history throughout the world. And this movie also shines a light on where that separation between gender and sex originally started, with researchers called John Money and there was another dude, and these were really despicable people that were idolized later. They even have movies about them, but their research was very flawed and they had really evil methodologies. And instead of punishing these people and literally throwing them into prison because some of the things they did were actually criminal, instead we adopted their basic research and we built an entire ideology on top of it. So that's kind of the boiling point of this movie. That's where you're at the peak of frustration, and then the last 20 minutes of this movie are a bit of release, luckily, because that's where we really see Matt Walsh go on the offensive, and we see him go on the Dr. Phil show and talk about this issue. We see him go to Loudoun County, which was the school where a rape was committed by a transgender person, and he really does confront the school board in a powerful way. And we see him write his children's book, Johnny the Walrus, which is both hilarious and really accurate, and we even see him reading that book to children in Africa, which is kind of hilarious because they don't even know what a walrus is probably, let alone somebody who identifies as one. But yeah, the ending of the movie does leave you with a little bit of hope, and I hope eventually they do just release this movie on YouTube as well, because like I said, I feel like people really need to see this, because there's a lot of people that don't share these very extreme views that are being pushed nowadays, and they are just not aware that this is happening in such a big way right now. But yeah, maybe you totally disagree with me, maybe I'm wrong, let me know where I'm wrong then. I'm open to having a discussion, which is also something a lot of people in this documentary obviously were not. Because like I said, it is a complicated and nuanced discussion. There's a lot of aspects to explore on this, and I do hope Matt Walsh makes more documentaries like this. But yeah, have you been able to see What is a Woman, or have you watched some of the clips on YouTube? Let me know what you thought of it. Thanks for watching my review anyway, and subscribe to my channel to keep up to date with everything going on in nerdcultuur.